Thanks everyone for joining us. Welcome to our panel on surfing as a team sport, riding the regulatory wave as a top competitor. My name is Fran Faircloth. I am a data privacy and cybersecurity partner at Ropes & Gray. I'm based out of DC. I have three great panelists with me today. Immediately to my right is Chris Hell, who is Senior Director and Associate General Counsel for Cyber and National Security at Cisco. In the middle, we have Maddie Neustadt, who is the owner of ForceDie Cyberkinetics. And on the far end, we have Jim Svikas, who is Assistant General Counsel at Microsoft Security. So welcome. Welcome, Chris, Maddie, and Jim. And today we're going to talk through some of the recent regulatory changes and how you can implement them within your team. We're going to talk about how you can be aware of these changes, how you can better use your team to get into compliance, and how you can use compliance as a competitive advantage. So 2022 brought a tidal wave of regulatory changes in a few different ways. So broadly speaking, a large swath of security regulation changes. Within that, changes in incident reporting and changes in secure software development. So on the security side, we have the DoD's CMMC 2.0 regime, which is going into place. And brought with it a lot of changes through that certification process. There have also been revisions to the EU NIS directive. Chinese security laws have seen increased enforcement and changes in 2022. And then India keeps floating a data protection bill that has different security requirements. Broadly speaking, we keep seeing different versions of that come through, so we're still kind of waiting on the final version of those security regulations. But even within that, on the incident reporting, India, for example, already has put into place the 6-hour reporting requirement. There's the 72-hour reporting requirements for critical infrastructure operators that have been put in place here in the US, as well as the SEC's proposal for public companies to report any incidents within 4 business days in an 8K, and the 24-hour incident reporting requirement for essential and important entities as part of the NIS2 in the EU. So in addition to broad security regulation changes and these incident reporting changes, we've also seen an increase in secure software development regulations. This has been a big regulatory focus in the past couple years. President Biden in May of 2021 issued his cybersecurity executive order, which proposed certain software security certification related requirements. It added SBOM requirements, software bill of materials requirements, which are flowed to contractors for the government. And similar requirements have been proposed for sellers of products that have a digital component in the EU cyber resiliency regulation. So all of these regulations create a whole new set of security requirements that your teams are being forced to deal with. And so what we're going to talk to you about today is how you can better implement these with your team. And we're going to start off with how do you become aware of these? And I'm going to throw it to Maddie first. So within your team, how are you looking out for these things and becoming more aware of them?
Well, one thing I would pose, I'm looking out at the audience, who out there is a lawyer? Okay, we got a few. Who is forced to work with lawyers? Lawyers, raise your hands too. You know that applies to you. Keeping up with this stuff is crazy because even after everything that Fran mentioned, that is pending legislation, pending regulation, we also have the courts stepping in. 2021 had the Schrems II decision in Europe that just absolutely upended GDPR compliance. A lot of what's going on in GDPR enforcement through the courts in Europe is impacting the cybersecurity realm. Because I don't know how many of you know this, but you do have personal data. Stop deluding yourself. It is all personal data almost. If you have user data, you have login data, it's personal data. The GDPR does apply. We're getting into these cyber resiliency acts that even though it's not specifically spelled out in the legislation that an SBOM is required, the practical reality is you're almost going to be impossible to comply with the Cyber Resiliency Act unless you do have SBOMs. So these are all common practices that can fulfill a variety of legal regulatory requirements. So when you get into legal compliance, you're also moving into these legal regimes that are no longer just for the lawyers to document, put it in a notice somewhere, fix a contract, and you can do whatever you want. You have to start working with your lawyers to figure out what's going on. And one of the best ways that non-legal professionals can work with their legal teams, whether it's in-house or outside, is to become more aware of the laws that are in place and are coming down the pipeline. Doesn't mean you have to go become an expert in the law, but there's a lot of free resources online. Law firms will publish blogs talking about upcoming legislation. Some firms are better than others in terms of giving you actionable content that you can make policy on, but more likely they're to get you to look at your operations and start asking questions and form those questions and go to your legal team and said, hey, I read about this new NIS 2 directive on critical infrastructure. Is what we do critical infrastructure? And work with your lawyers to go through that analysis to figure out what it is. Form your questions, because when the non-lawyers come to the legal team and say, oh, just give us a checklist, what do we do? There's way too many laws that you would have to scan and figure out, okay, what's a checklist? Come with a question. Is this critical infrastructure? Is this personal data? Are we crossing borders with our data? Because all of those things have impact under the law, and to recognize them up front as a fact scenario and go to your lawyers really helps the legal team. And of course, the lawyers, you want to be familiar with these laws so you can go to your clients and say, hey, there's a new requirement for cybersecurity maturity matrix that we want to make sure that we're at a maturity level 2 in order to keep this core business active. What are we doing? Who's working on getting that certification? Do we have a plan? Do we have a roadmap? So we have to all work together on that. You can get on email and list subscriptions. I use LinkedIn heavily, not only for self-promotion, because that's what we all do on LinkedIn, but also to figure out who to follow, who's posting the most informative content on staying up to speed with the EU, the EDPB in Europe, and I work heavily across the European US borders. The EDPB in Europe has a great LinkedIn account that you can follow, and they post upcoming regulation. Also gives you an idea of how they're thinking in terms of what the enforcement actions are. If you follow them long enough, you start getting concerned about what they're looking at for enforcement, but it gives you an idea of what they mean by risk-based. A lot of legislation and regulation, get these governments, they say, we'd like to take a risk-based approach. Nobody knows what that means. And sometimes the government doesn't even know what it means. It means that when they determine something's risky, they're going to make regulation around it, but there's not a lot of transparency in that. You also see a lot of churn right now. Has anybody heard of this little thing called ChatGPT? I mean, a few people have been talking about it. My mother asked me if our presentation was generated by ChatGPT. That's how I know it really has hit prime time. It seems like every government around the world right now is scrambling to figure out how do we regulate ChatGPT. So how do you stay up to speed on that? You've got to get into these listservs, these emails, these curated news feeds, work with your outside counsel, figure out what questions to ask and who to ask them of. But there's a lot of great free resources that are keeping track of this to really help you clarify your questions. Because what overwhelms lawyers and governance, risk, and compliance professionals is when somebody comes to you and just says, what are we doing about ChatGPT? Well, that's a broad, I'm not going to curse on stage, that's a broad question. So what are you doing? Well, what's the concern? Where are you sourcing your data from? How are you using it? Are you developing intellectual property with it? Are you developing source code? Are you testing? So you have to know more about the actions you're actually taking so that you can form the right questions to answer under the law. Because if you start too broad, it's going to be like, I don't even know what the correct analogy is. Literally trying to boil the ocean.
Yeah.
You have to figure out what your real issue is.
I would just add too that I think benchmarking with the industry associates is really a good idea too. I mean, as a lawyer, right? I mean, I'm commonly going to just fellow lawyers at other companies saying, hey, what are you guys looking at? What are you following, right? And then non-lawyers as well, whether it's in your function, if you're in supply chain or in the contracts, or if you're working in a compliance role as an engineer. There's just a really, really good resource, because if you're looking at it, there's probably somebody else in the industry looking at the similar thing. And it can be helpful to, carefully benchmark. Obviously, you have to be, not reveal proprietary information, but it's pretty easy to do that. I mean, just to be able to have a chat and be able to get information you need.
And when you benchmark, make sure it's a company in the same industry with the same risk level. I have clients that both, create online consumer products, and also I have clients who do safety inspections for oil rigs. Not the same risk level. So if you benchmark on the right industry.
True, but even cross-industry, we have opportunities to be woken up to a risk or to a regulation that I haven't thought of yet. Whether it's sort of my friend who works in the consumer space saying, I am spending all of my time working on ABC. What are you thinking about that? And I say, boy, that has not risen to above the threshold for me yet. But now I know I need to look into that, and I bet I can find that second resource, because I think one thing that maybe we should throw out to everybody is a little bit of empathy, that this is hard. This is very, very, very difficult. There's a reason that we keep throwing out these disaster-related words around the level of regulation that we're seeing. There's a lot, and it's coming to us from lots of different directions because of all the overlap of AI regulation and supply chain regulation tend to come together in places like cybersecurity and privacy, and so if you're yourself looking at this and saying, boy, this is very, very difficult for me to keep track of, trust me when I say you're not alone. Every single one of us feel this way, and my friends and colleagues here love to tease me as coming from a place of privilege when we talk about this, because Microsoft does have a pretty well built out set of expert teams on things like privacy and responsible AI and things like that.
That's why we still call him, even.
That's right. That's the only reason they're nice to me.
We want to raise the issue with Jim so that he pays for outside counsel and he shares his experience.
But honestly, my experience isn't that different from everybody else's, because that just means that I get the opportunity to be overwhelmed by my own colleagues rather than being overwhelmed by the new regulation that comes to me on LinkedIn. I get that too, but I get internal white papers. But yeah, it is true for all of us that we are all trying to figure out how to keep track of things. One particular source of information on what to pay attention to that I and Microsoft have found, collectively have found really valuable is customers. If you are especially a vendor of software or cloud services, things like that, then you are selling to customers who are themselves thinking about their own regulatory compliance. And every conversation that you have with a customer is going to be an opportunity to realize a dimension of concern that you weren't conscious of. And we're going to talk a lot more about how you balance those different concerns. This right now is all about, or this section is all about awareness. And when the customer comes to you and says, I need help in documenting for my own DPIA our data flows that may leave Europe, then that may, if you haven't been thinking about data flows out of Europe, that's going to be your cue, and the GDPR may not directly be telling you to make decisions A, B, C, and D, but it'll be in the nature of serving your customers and being able to continue to partner with them that you will you'll realize, oh no, I do need that extra step. I do need to be paying more attention to data flows, responsible AI, SBOM, et cetera, et cetera.
And Jim's got a great point with, especially with customers. He puts it very politely when a customer comes to you and says, I have questions about transparency on data flows. Most of you probably may have the same experience as I do. It's when your sales guy calls you and says, customer says we're not compliant with this law. Or they send you, the lawyer's nightmare, they send you an email, we're in breach of this law. No, we're not, trust me. And even if we were, don't put that in email, please.
Yes.
So the customers may raise it in a more dramatic fashion, but it's still, that's where we have to look past our gut feeling and the initial punch in the stomach that we have that says, oh my God, are we non-compliant with this law? And use that as an opportunity to go learn, well, what do we do? What's the legal requirement to work on? And I've even done that great thing where I get something from a customer's lawyer that says, you're in violation of Italian law. And I'm like, Italian law is a really big thing. Could you be a little more specific? And send me the statute number you're looking at because I don't know what you're talking about. And that's kind of my code for, I'm going to have to go research this quickly.
Yeah.
So, but it's a great opportunity to continually learn. And I recently had an excellent opportunity to learn about Italian law. But I had to go back and said, I understand you have a concern under this national implementation. Can you send me information on it? And the lawyer on the other side was more than happy to send me the references that he was concerned about so that I could learn and we could have an engaged conversation on it.
It's a great reminder that every new interaction, every new question is a chance to flag something else for you to learn about and add to kind of your list of regulations. And when you're working on things, even if you're not a lawyer, when you're working with lawyers, every time they, come to you with a new consideration, it's kind of a good thing to kind of put in your mental file cabinet. So as you're pulling all these different regulations together, you then have to look at, okay, this is great. There are a lot of things to keep up with. How are we going to implement this within our teams? So Chris, can you tell us a little bit about how this can be implemented within teams using the resources that you have?
Sure. So I think, first of all, looking at just the horizon of a lot of these cyber laws, no surprise, there's a lot of commonality between them, right? I mean, I don't mean to over-exaggerate this, but, incident reporting, right? You're going to see that. You're going to see some kind of reference to a security control, usually, that you need to follow either in your enterprise or in your products being sold. And those two you see pretty commonly. You do see we see emerging trends like sovereignty and then SBOMs. These are kind of newer trends, and probably as we see more of these, there'll be some more commonality among those two. But for now, I mean, just talking about incident response, for example, it's easy to get kind of twisted around all these varieties of incident response. And I think a common reaction is a focus on the deadline. It's like, oh wow, India, 6 hours, and 72 hours for CERCIA or for GDPR or for DFARS, and then there's all these different kinds of, or four business days, right, for materiality determinations, right? I think for a lot of these statutes and regulations that we see, I mean, bottom line is they want companies to report incidents as quickly as possible, as reasonably as possible, right? So I mean, I've never seen a regulator or even a customer get mad when you've really followed your processes, you've done everything you reasonably can, and you report at hour 73, right, versus 72, or even a day later. I mean, usually where you get in trouble is where you don't have your stuff together internally, and different parts of your business are not talking to that part of the business or bringing a lawyer at the right time, and you've got a very late report, right? So I think in the end, a lot of the...
or if somebody tries to hide it before they bring it to the SOC or the legal team, then you're going to get in trouble.
Yeah, even worse. So basically, having a good incident response plan, making sure that different parts of your organization are generally aware that they need to be reporting to some central place, right? I've noticed is a good strategy. and then ensuring you've got someone who's an expert on these various regulations, or at least can bring in the experts, right? Oftentimes it's like a cyber lawyer of some sort at a larger organization who can then bring in the privacy lawyers as needed, or or the export control lawyers, or et cetera. Or if you're a smaller company, then probably that one lawyer will bring an outside counsel, or just try to look for all that stuff herself or himself, right? So I think there's that, and then if you're a lawyer in a legal team, right, of just ensuring that there's even a legal incident response process where if you've got like a lawyer on point of having the subject matter expert lawyers ready and they're practiced and you know how to reach them very quickly, I think a lot of that can help you get to where you need to go. And then the last point on that, on incident response, is of course knowing what your sales folks are agreeing to to customers, because oftentimes with the pressure of the deal, there's definitely an incentive and some pressure to agree to, I don't know, like agreeing to reporting within 24 hours, even a suspected vulnerability, right? Which is very, very tough. So of course, making sure that you've got some level of process around what types of incident response obligations your sales folks are agreeing to.
Chris, that is an excellent point, because we talked about the regulatory tidal wave of laws and the legislation, but it's also important to keep in mind that contracts form private laws between parties. And if your salespeople are fully empowered to agree to anything in a contract, you have to keep track of that legal stuff separately. So your contract management processes, as security becomes more required in the contracting and supply chain aspect, which now with the PIPL and the GDPR and the UK GDPR, we have these standard contractual clauses that address what constitutes reasonable security and your secure practices. You have to keep track of what is in your contracts and what people are agreeing to, as well as these legislative things.
No.
And don't ever fool yourself that you as an organization will remember that special exception for that really important customer. Yeah. If it is, and this is obviously when at the scale that we operate at Microsoft, we have no choice on this. But I think it's probably we should all be looking at it this way. If your special case isn't built into your common framework, into your controls, into your system, you're going to fail. And you're going to, because maybe the one person who remembers this special case is on vacation when the big incident happens. And so every time whether you're taking on board a new regulation or it's coming to you by way of contract, it needs to land in that common framework and your single approach. Lawyers are not known for their program management skills most of the time, and so people with that skill I tend to admire and actively try to partner with, and this is one of those areas where a collective partnership across the business to drive that kind of framework can be super valuable. You can rely on expertise in the moment, in the heat of the moment, but it is so much more healthy and pleasant for everybody to think about those things ahead of time. Apply that program management, project management mindset, and say, instead of running and calling the lawyer or calling the compliance person or outside counsel every single time, are there flowcharts that we can create? Are there checklists? If we think about it ahead of time, can we get ourselves all pointed in the same direction so that our system actually knows how to deal with this particular problem? I can tell you, it is not easy to put together that flow chart. I'm in the process of doing that on some data flows right now, and it is hard. But I know, and I keep reminding myself that this is the chance to take myself out of hero mode and sort of function systematically. Hero mode makes me feel special, but it exhausts me and it results in me working on holidays, and maybe I'm far enough into my career that I should be trying to avoid those things.
Yeah, and the last point I would make too is that don't make the mistake of thinking you know what the incident reporting laws are, right? Because I think there's a tendency to think that, oh, it's a hoodie and a hacker, right? A lot of the laws now are just basic availability incidents, right? Has nothing to do with a hacker or even data exposure. It's just like your service is offline for a while. And so just work closely with your legal folks to know that, hey, there may be some triggers that you're not aware of that needs to be brought to your legal team.
Even things like, I think the official phrase is misdirected emails.
Yeah.
Fat-fingered, you mistyped the email and you sent the data to the wrong person, but it happened to be, the salary report for your executives, and now you've sent it to the wrong person. Or the autofill used the personal email, the Gmail account instead of their work account, and now it's left the company. I want to say like last week somebody got in trouble for sending something to their Gmail account, supposedly by mistake. It was hard to tell from the news articles, and when you work in this area long enough too, you only believe about 25% of what you read in the Wall Street Journal and Washington Post. But they said they sent a very sensitive file to a Gmail account versus a corporate account. That could be a security incident. That could be a privacy incident. That could be reportable to regulators. It could be reportable to individuals. So you have to have all of that considered in your incident response and reporting programs.
Yeah, that's a good point. And let me just move on to the controls framework. A lot of these these laws that come about, there's a lot of commonality in the type of controls that they require. No surprise. Think about, access controls, encryption, business continuity, right? No surprise. And most companies, have some kind of, base level of controls that they follow, whether it's ISO or whether it's SOC 2, or if you're in like the defense industry, it's likely NIST, right? And if you don't have one that you're following, you probably should get one right away, right? Because you're going to want that anyway for your customers, because they're going to be asking if they're not already. And so the idea here is that when you're going out and seeing new laws come out, or new regulations, or new certification requirements come up around the world, it's helpful to have a control framework internally where you can start out. One way to do it is to start out and have all mapped out. Here's the controls I follow. Here's the narratives in the control frameworks, and then here's the actual artifacts that I use to actually be ready to show regulators or to show a certifier if needed. And then let's say you want to move on to another jurisdiction. You want to sell in Germany with C5, or France with Sectum Cloud, or Japan with ISMAP, or there's just alphabet soup, right? You can just go on and see. Well, we can plug them into your framework and see, okay, which ones would I already meet? Which artifacts do I have? And what's the delta? Right? And then there are a lot of companies that do this, and actually Cisco
has a great spreadsheet.
Yeah,
I'm gonna plug this for him.
Yeah, thank you. No, and there's no, Cisco put it out for free on its website and gets no remuneration, so it's out there for folks who need it. But they basically have mapped together. It's called the Cisco Cloud Compliance Framework. They've mapped a number of certification frameworks, and you can look at the tool and see which artifacts that you can have for a certain certification framework that can also work for other frameworks. So that's one way to do it. But that's a way where, given that there's not all that much creativity in security controls, it's a way that you can operate more efficiently, more effectively. And then the last point I'll make is around structuring data flows. So hey, if a lot of these rules that you see are basically apply if you have a certain data, right? We mentioned with GDPR with personal data, or DoD CMMC if you have DoD controlled and classified information. If you can find a way to structure your systems to limit or actually just put them on a certain area of the network, then you may be able to find a way to really limit the applicability of these rules in the first place.
Some of it may even just be how long you're retaining it.
Right. No, exactly. So I think that's also sometimes an overlooked area, but it's also difficult, right? To structure and architect your network to find out where all the data is and put in a certain area or put in a certain jurisdiction so it doesn't have to be transferred out. This is not easy work, right? But it is something that if you're able to architect a system, it's definitely very good to keep that in mind, right? To kind of architect it in a way to limit its exposure to regulations.
Yeah, and to add to that, and what Fran just snuck in there, retention.
Yeah.
Everybody thinks about cybersecurity, regulatory compliance, and they're like, incident response. And you're like, delete the data.
Yeah.
Just like privacy, cybersecurity too, you need to have automated retention policies to get rid of stuff that would harm your company, even if it's controls. Get rid of the stuff you're not using. It doesn't do you any good if there is a breach. Being able to systematically and automate retention policies is helpful across every cybersecurity, data privacy, and data governance program. But make sure it works. Don't test it in production before you start deleting stuff. Yeah, but
I'd also, there's the documentation component of a lot of these regulations too, and I think that's another area where you'll find the legwork you're doing on putting together your DPIA for GDPR purposes is going to be super helpful when when the next AI regulations come into play, or sort of like pick your
the
regulation.
Cyber Resiliency Act,
Cyber
definitely.
resiliency, absolutely, and in every one of those cases, you're going to appreciate, it is the same set of using your documentation to demonstrate your thinking that you have considered these issues. And honestly, in general, if you want to demonstrate and you're ever called on to demonstrate that you're doing your best, even if your best falls a little short, having the documentation that shows we weren't ad hoc about this, we were systematic about this. That's the whole point of the DPIA, but it's actually super helpful just across the board. The other point that we have over here on the slide is none of us are in this alone, and if we try to go it alone within our own organization, we're kind of missing the point. This is the theme of this conference is Stronger Together, and this is the place where legal trying to do it by ourselves is going to be dumb. It will be unsuccessful. Legal together with compliance, compliance teams way better. Legal together with compliance and engineering, and product. And
dare I say internal audit? Right?
Internal. Oh my
Yeah.
God, yes.
Yeah.
I am a huge fan of internal audit. That is,
Phrases you don't hear often.
that may be a weird thing to say, but my own client team got an internal audit report a couple months ago that was less than full green, and every single one of us looked at that and said, that is wonderful, because the gaps that they identified are the gaps that we already were aware of, and internal audit can become a driver of change in a way that a lot of the time the rest of us are not fully capable of creating the organizational momentum. That internal audit report can be the driver for identifying the gap that we collectively are going to work together to figure out the best way forward on.
Absolutely. So now that you've got your team all set up and you know what you're looking for, you've got to ride the wave home. So how, Jim, now that you're talking about how to bring everyone in on your team and how to work with internal audit and all the different players, how do you monitor this going forward and make sure that you've got the right approach and it's working and you're tolerating risk where you need to and keeping everything afloat?
Well, the thing to remember for all of us is that we can't be at 100% on every one of these things. We can try, and we will work 24/7, 365, because that's the amount of regulation, the number of different things coming at us as a collective group is too much for perfection to be the goal. So that's an area, and I have a favorite story that I like to frame up for this, because you do need to find the right-sized approach for your specific organization and the thing that meets the needs of your organization. And when I think about this, I think about in June 2018. So we are a month into GDPR being in effect. And I run into, at an event, I run into a friend who had been at Microsoft and had left to become the first lawyer at a much smaller startup. And we're talking about GDPR, and I'm saying, oh man, I'm doing so much. She described it. She's like, oh yeah, I took care of GDPR in an afternoon because I rewrote our privacy statement, and that pretty much addressed what we needed to do. And from GDPR, we're good to go. And I looked at that, and my first thought was, oh my God, there is so much that you haven't done, and you don't, and from what you're saying, you don't realize. But that's framed through, you know, my own perspective in that moment of having been at Microsoft, where we had a different threat understanding from GDPR. Because I think actually my friend's choice was the right choice for her organization. Full on, like pull out all the stops for GDPR is probably not appropriate for a startup. Probably her energy was best directed at increasing revenue for her employer, and to redirect all of their energy onto onto compliance, where they are highly unlikely to be targeted, at least in the first year or two. And part of prioritization is deciding to wait till later, as opposed to Microsoft. We could be pretty confident that we were going to get scrutiny from day one. And so of course we had to pull out all the stops and re-architect the company to some extent, and things like that. So step one for each and every one of us is to look at not at what the entirety is telling us, but what does our specific organization need? This is another opportunity to listen to our customers, in fact, because they will be the ones, if we remember that the goal of a business is to continue to carry out its mission and produce its products and make money, then compliance becomes an essential component of meeting that mission, but it's not the actual goal of the organization. And so like classify our goals in light of what does our specific organization mean. There's a lot of ways to think about this. With any individual law, it's worth also considering what are the risks that law was created to address, and think about where those risks to people, where they risks to privacy, risks to data, risks to human life. Those are all good reasons. And lately, critical infrastructure regulation. Should I be prioritizing that more if I think I'm in that space? Yeah, you probably should, because when critical infrastructure goes bad, that is at best devastating to the economy, at worst devastating to human life. And so as we balance out the various risks we're thinking about, we've highlighted a whole range of types of risks that you as a business may be faced with, and you should give due consideration to each one of them. Some laws are going to carry with them criminal penalty, and it is my personal goal as an in-house lawyer to not have any of my clients go to jail. And honestly, not go to jail. I would like to keep them well away from that possibility. So of course that plays into the risk tolerance. But it does work its way up in terms of different types and different range of risk. Civil penalties can still be devastating to the business. They can still be, they certainly have substantial impact. Right.
I didn't mean to interrupt you,
Yeah.
Jim, but one of the things to look at too is these risks can change over time too. His colleague with the startup, at the time GDPR was going live and you had the startup be like, hey, I updated my privacy policies. That is enough for now.
Right.
It is not the end. You're not done at that point. You still have to keep up to date on that. Same thing with the risk. All the laws have a specific risk they're trying to mitigate in mind, and you can see what is my current risk for the company. But as your business expands, as your customer base expands, maybe you haven't been in critical infrastructure, and now you have one key client who is in critical infrastructure. You have to reevaluate and constantly be looking at what the risk profile is so that you can update your controls accordingly.
Yeah. And so how do we manage risks? Well, first of all, it's worth remembering that lawyers, CISOs, the collective group here, we're all here to think about managing risks every step of the way. So the lawyer answer to these things is not that different from the CISO answer. But one part, we can manage risk by avoiding certain activities that are likely, or avoiding certain partners. That's our due diligence of, if I have a set of regulations that I'm worried about, and part of the consideration is which partner I choose is going to greater or lesser impact on that risk, then I can address that by diligence. If I'm going to a cloud provider, diligence is reviewing, is making sure that they have their own control framework and their own audits, and reviewing their audits and understanding their choices around data flows and things like that. And that's where transferring risk comes into play as well, because we have shared responsibility in sort of the interconnected world of, especially if you're relying on cloud providers and things like that. Shared responsibility means that in some cases you are ensuring through, say, customer agreements that when you are selling your product to the customer understands that part of the responsibility for compliance with regulation is on them as well as you. You are going to do your part, but you are empowering your customer to make a set of choices, and it's their responsibility as well. And it's best to capture that kind of thing in your agreements rather than try and rely on some common understanding. And the reference to supplier agreements is the exact same, is the same point in the opposite direction. If you are relying on a cloud provider, a consultant, a managed service provider, things like that, you need to also be making sure you're allocating and you have a common understanding of whose responsibility is it to make sure that the data stays in Europe, or that it is documented when it flows somewhere else, or you name your preference. And so that's another place where we are transferring, or we are using our contracts to allocate risk appropriately. Maddie mentioned earlier or actually may have been in a conversation yesterday. Actually, I'm forgetting at this point. But when it comes to SBOMs, the right answer may be tell your vendor that I expect you to provide an SBOM, and then maybe for that aspect of it, you are done because you have
Kind of.
demanded.
A lot of these laws now also have an obligation for people to manage and monitor their compliance. That's actually in the legislation of the registration. So if you have a vendor agreement that says you have to provide an SBOM, make sure you get it.
Yes.
Don't put it in the contract and forget that you have it there. You need to get it, and you need to keep track of it. You need to put it into your administrative record keeping for your artifacts to show compliance should it ever be tested, or should you need it because you wake up and the headline news is, new 0-day vulnerability found in your product or your vendor, and you need to know where's it at. And then if you haven't received your SBOMs from your vendors yet, all of a sudden you're scrambling. The incident response team or the vulnerability management team says, do we have this vuln in our supply chain? Like, oh, well, we required SBOMs of all of our vendors. Great, let me see them. Well, we didn't get them, we just required them. So, you put yourself behind the ball.
Yeah, there's one specific, one final point I wanted to make around benchmarking. The value of benchmarking is obvious at some level. It is, where do I sit relative to others that I have a lot in common with. But one thing I want to highlight there, benchmarking is absolutely a great way to understand when you are falling short on compliance with regulation. That's clearly very important. You don't want to be the laggard who becomes the regulator's best example, object lesson. But if you are well overshooting, which is another thing you can learn from benchmarking, if you are going well beyond what your peer organizations are doing, that may suggest that you are investing your resources poorly. And that's, if there's an opportunity cost for all of these things, and to do too much means that you are neglecting potentially some other aspect of compliance.
And the one thing that benchmarking gets you is like a lot of the statutory language for security, it just says reasonable.
Yeah.
well, what is reasonable? Benchmarking can help you understand what is considered reasonable.
You can also look at other companies' supply chain agreements on the web, right? Many of them make them available.
true.
So that's a
This
place
is
you
true.
can
Free
look.
resources.
Yeah.
I know we got a couple
Should we
minutes
open?
left. Do we
Yes, yeah, we can open it up for questions. One final thought before questions that we wanted to make sure we kind of got through in the theme of this presentation is that don't think of compliance as, and all of these regulations, as just a burden. Getting ahead of things, getting ahead of the wave, thinking about it proactively instead of when a problem hits can really help reduce the need for legal review. It may mean that those of you who aren't lawyers but only have to work with them can maybe talk to them. You know, if you an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Did I mess that up? Is
Yes.
that right?
Yes.
Okay. I've forgotten all of my sayings during COVID, I guess. But talking to them in advance can really help to reduce the need to kind of be in that hero mode, as Jim said later, where you're all in a crisis room dealing with something, and it can really help your business gain a competitive advantage.
We have a question in the front row.
Great.
Who of you are using automated contracts as a foundation, utilizing existing contract requirements and localization governance?
I haven't used much automated contracting just because most of my major clients have been using forms and templates for quite some time. So we iterate on existing templates so that we avoid making wholesale changes that would maybe just alarm our customers, even if they weren't a major substantive change. If you completely redo a contract, it raises eyebrows. So I haven't been using any automated contract development tools.
Okay. Next one is, won't machine intelligence be a savior for the connection of IT governance with a general counsel and be able to do that organization of the workflow for us in a much more efficient way? Yes, it might not be optimum and it might have some glitches, but isn't that the way forward to optimize the limited staff that we have on both the IT and the
Tool.
legal side?
Absolutely. I think we have a responsibility to think about all of the available tools, and I think the latest stage of machine learning, the large language models and things like that are going to be a super valuable component of that in helping us understand complexity. There's no substitute for the people in the room for integrating that, but everything that we can have to kind of help with that understanding and help with the pre-filtering can be
It is
valuable.
still very nascent, though, and
That's right.
we got to make sure that it's accurate. Right now, I would not trust a lot of the tools to give a complete answer that is feasible or would hold up. We have a lot of courts coming out right now saying you cannot rely on it. If you rely on generative AI for some of these things, lawyers particularly, it could be a violation of your ethical duty of competence. And I'm not about to lose my license due to ChatGPT.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen some promising tools where, if they can quickly identify the types of data you have within your organization, that'd be super, super helpful, right? Just
Yeah.
taking that and just being able to advise based on the data types would be helpful.
It's a tool, but it needs a check right now.
Yeah,
It still
yeah,
needs
yeah.
a balance of power type thing.
Right. Last question, probably.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. That
Make
was
it
a
good.
really good conversation. I really enjoyed it. I have about 50 questions, but I'm going to limit it to 2.5 questions if that's okay. So, number one, you had kind of made a little joke about, even if we don't write this down, and that kind of struck home to me because I find it sometimes difficult, especially in very large conglomerate, multinational organizations, to convey risks effectively for that exact reason. I'm told, don't write that down, right?
You can convey the risk without coming to the conclusion. That's usually the challenge.
Okay.
Like convey the facts. The
Okay.
facts will or will not screw you over in court depending on the facts. But if you draw a legal conclusion on behalf of your lawyers and you're not the lawyer, you have some privilege issues that you're going to have a hard time with.
What about just vulnerabilities, talking about, the existence of certain vulnerabilities? I mean, the knowledge of these vulnerabilities, you can't act on every vulnerability. It's actually,
Yeah, right.
it's impossible.
That's
So
right.
is the documentation of those vulnerabilities then putting an organization at risk if they're not acted upon?
No, it's just a fact. You should have a policy in place as to when you act on a vulnerability and when you don't.
Okay.
If you just keep a whole list and you've got CVE 9s that you're taking no action on and CVE 1s that you are taking action on.
Right.
Like, yeah,
Hopefully
you'd have
not,
some,
but yeah.
you'd have some challenges, but just having a list of the vulnerabilities, I don't think would cause you inordinate risk as long as you had a system by which you
Don't
deal
be,
with them.
right, don't be arbitrary. Have,
Okay.
have a reason, and this is, in some ways, the documentation is your friend
Yep.
if the documentation represents systematic thinking
Yep.
rather than arbitrary or panic.
Yep.
You panic,
Yeah.
fear panic, but don't be afraid to write down when you've been thoughtful and systematic.
Right.
All right,
Great.
Great.
that is perfect.
All right.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.